I didn't say yes right away, but I didn't say no either. And maybe that pause was louder than either answer, because Richard had simply smiled and said he'd expect me around 7. And that was how I ended up standing in front of my closet on a Thursday night, holding a soft gray sweater in one hand and a sleeveless blouse in the other, wondering when the last time was that I'd cared this much about what I wore to dinner with someone I technically barely knew. It wasn't a date, of course not. He was just my neighbor, someone I'd bumped into on evening walks or at the mailbox, a man who always spoke with a kind of quiet patience like he had all the time in the world. And tonight was just about company, about not eating alone again in front of a muted television and a plate I'd barely taste. And still I chose the blouse, added mascara, and told myself it was just to feel more awake, not because I wanted to see his eyes linger when I stepped inside his home. His house smelled faintly of rosemary and something citrusy, the kind of scent that clings to cast iron and memory, and the table was already set when I arrived, a single candle flickering between mismatched plates and a bottle of white wine breathing on the counter, the cork already loosened as if he knew I wouldn't say no. We started with the usual. How long had he lived on this street? What kind of work did I do now that I wasn't teaching full-time? Had I tried that new place on Bellevue that promised artisan sandwiches and locally brewed kombucha? And I laughed at the word artisan. And he smirked in that way that said he knew exactly how ridiculous it sounded. And something in me relaxed like an old hinge finally shifting without resistance. The salmon was grilled perfectly, the skin crisp, the flesh soft without being fragile, and I told him as much, complimented the sear, the hint of lemon, and he poured a second glass of wine while telling me he used to cook for his wife, that she liked meals that tasted simple but took time to get right. And though his voice didn't tremble, something in it paused, just long enough to notice. And I responded not with words, but with a nod, a slow one, like I understood loss, even if I didn't know the exact shape of his. The conversation, like the wine, moved without force, shifting from travel to books to an old black-and-white movie neither of us could remember the title of, but both insisted we'd seen on late-night cable when that was still a thing. And each time he laughed, low and a little gravelly, I found myself leaning in, not because I couldn't hear, but because I wanted to stay near the warmth of someone who didn't need to fill silence with noise. At one point, while telling a story about a disastrous anniversary dinner involving burnt risotto and a broken chair leg, he leaned forward slightly to gesture toward the napkin beside me, perhaps to point something out or to reset the conversation's rhythm. And in that small, unremarkable motion, something about his ease allowed me to feel unexpectedly present, in the moment, and I didn't pull away, didn't flinch or change the subject, just let the moment breathe between us, steady and charged and carefully ignored. We sat there longer than I meant to, the night folding around us gently, cicadas humming outside the screened porch, the wine now down to the last few inches in the bottle, and I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once, hadn't thought about unanswered emails, or the blinking voicemail icon that waited every night but never brought anything worth hearing. Eventually, the air shifted, not with awkwardness, but with the kind of natural pause that comes when everything has been said that needs to be. And just as I was about to gather my things, thank him, make a quiet, polite exit, he glanced toward the hallway and said casually, like it was just another detail, "My son might stop by. He sometimes drops in on his way home. Hope you don't mind." And I smiled without thinking, nodded before I had a chance to wonder why those words sent a ripple through my chest, why the mention of someone else arriving felt like a door I wasn't ready to walk through, but couldn't stop myself from approaching. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that the quickened pulse in my throat was just the wine or the late hour or the intimacy of a room filled with soft light and the sound of a man's voice echoing gently across a wooden table, and not the fact that someone else was coming, someone I hadn't met, someone I was already imagining without permission. Richard didn't seem to notice the shift in me, or if he did, he didn't call it out, instead rising to collect the plates, his movements easy, practiced, the kind of casual grace that comes from years of routine rather than performance, and I stood too, more out of instinct than necessity, feeling the buzz of proximity again as I joined him at the sink. He handed me a towel without asking, and I dried the dishes in silence. Not uncomfortable, just aware. More aware than I had been in a long time of the way someone moved near me, the smell of citrus soap on his hands, the way his shoulder brushed mine once, then again, not forcefully, just inevitably, like we were moving on rails laid by something older than intention. We laughed a little more, softer now, the kind of laughter that doesn't need volume to fill a room, And he told me a story about how he once tried to tile the guest bathroom himself and ended up gluing a quarter to the floor, claiming it as his personal signature, and I liked that about him, the way he told stories without apology, as though the flaws were part of the design. When he stepped out briefly to check on the porch lights, I wandered toward the bookshelf, by the fireplace, scanning the titles without reading them, just needing a place to rest my hands to ground myself, to avoid looking like I was waiting for someone I wasn't supposed to be thinking about yet, and that's when I heard it. A soft knock, 2 sharp raps against the wood, casual but clear. Richard's voice carried from the front hallway, low and warm, and I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. And then I heard a second voice, younger, lower, and steadier than I expected, not boisterous like someone trying to fill a room, but firm in that quiet way that makes you listen harder. And then he appeared. He didn't walk in, so much as arrive, unhurried, like the space had always been meant to include him, and when his eyes met mine, they didn't widen or scan or search, they just settled, like he already knew who I was, like nothing about me surprised him, and yet everything about his gaze made me shift slightly where I stood. He looked like his father, but only around the eyes, that same calm intensity, but sharper, more focused, less softened by age and experience, and though he smiled, just barely, there was something in the way he held his frame that made the air between us contract by a breath. Richard motioned toward the kitchen, offering coffee or what was left of the wine, and the younger man, Evan, he said, introducing him with the kind of casual pride that comes from watching someone grow up well, declined both, saying he was just stopping by on his way through, but the way his eyes lingered on me said he wasn't in a hurry. We exchanged simple greetings, names, nothing more, but in those few words, something happened. Something I couldn't name, only feel. Like a quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures but roots itself somewhere deeper. He didn't sit. Not right away. Just leaned lightly against the back of the chair Richard had left pulled out for him, his hands resting loosely at his sides. And when the conversation resumed, it was like he'd always been part of it. Not an interruption, but an extension, as though the evening had been building toward this configuration all along. We spoke about nothing at first. Traffic, weather, a broken vending machine at the gas station he'd stopped at on the way, and yet every word felt layered, like we were all speaking around something we hadn't agreed to name. At one point, Richard laughed and stood to refill the wine after all, even though neither of us had asked. And in the brief silence that followed his footsteps to the kitchen, Evan looked at me again, not long, not intrusively, just directly, and said, "He talks more when you're around." And the comment, so simple, so uncalculated, made my throat catch before I managed to smile. I didn't know what to say, so I just looked down at the edge of the table, traced the grain of the wood with one finger, and hoped he couldn't see how my hands had suddenly forgotten how to be still. When Richard returned, the moment folded quietly back into the rhythm of 3 people pretending this wasn't anything more than what it looked like from the outside, but inside, beneath the candlelight and wine and all the words left unspoken, something had shifted. And I knew it because I could feel it sitting there between us, waiting. When he stepped back into the room, the light from the kitchen caught the edge of the box he was carrying, simple and unmarked except for the bakery's wax string, and for a moment I watched his hands more than his face, not because I was avoiding his eyes, but because there was something about the way he moved, unhurried, measured, like someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone, that made it impossible not to notice how deliberately he carried even the smallest things. And when he set the box down on the counter with a quiet thud, Richard looked over and said, "He's the serious one," with a laugh that didn't quite hide the affection behind it. Evan smiled, but only slightly, the kind of expression that doesn't ask for attention and doesn't give away much either. And I could already sense that he wasn't the kind of person who filled the room with noise or motion, rather someone who observed first, stepped in second, and only spoke when the silence had something to offer back. And as he untied the string and opened the lid, revealing a pecan tart with an almost perfect golden crust, he said, "You exaggerate." And the way his voice held its calm, even tone made me glance up before I could stop myself. There was no shift in his posture, no effort to dominate the space or draw focus toward himself, but his presence had weight, the kind that didn't come from volume or bravado, but from how still he remained, and how thoroughly he seemed to absorb everything happening around him before responding with something that sounded less like an opinion and more like a conclusion, reached quietly while everyone else was still speaking. We sat again, this time with Evan at the head of the table where Richard had motioned for him to take a seat. And though the conversation picked up naturally with jokes about how often the bakery got Evan's order wrong and how he kept going back anyway, I noticed how quickly he aligned with the rhythm we'd already established, offering short, dry comments that landed more cleverly than expected, making Richard laugh in that quiet, delighted way that only a parent can when their child says something clever without trying to be. And still, what caught me most wasn't what Evan said, but the way he listened, leaning forward slightly without fidgeting, his fingers resting calmly around the base of his glass, his eyes not drifting aimlessly like people often do in casual company, but landing on whomever was speaking with the kind of direct but not invasive focus that makes you speak more carefully, like you've just realized you're actually being heard. At one point, as I was explaining a story about a colleague who once accidentally locked herself inside a faculty supply closet and had to call the janitor from her smartwatch, I felt his eyes on me, not sharply, not intensely, but steadily, like he was following the details not just to laugh, but to understand what I found funny. And when our eyes met, it wasn't charged or awkward, just quiet and sudden and enough to make me forget what came next in the story for the space of a single heartbeat. I recovered quickly, let the moment pass without comment. But it happened again, and then again, not with any particular rhythm or intent. Just those brief collisions of attention where I'd catch him watching me not in a way that made me feel exposed, but in a way that made me wonder if he was piecing something together that even I hadn't figured out yet. And every time it happened, I felt a slow awareness building inside me. Not urgent, not dramatic, but steady and undeniably present. When Richard got up to serve dessert, he joked about how he was going to butcher the slicing job, and I shifted in my seat to help him by grabbing the side plates from the hutch just behind Evan's chair. And as I moved past him, careful not to bump into anything, I moved past him to reach for the plates. We navigated the narrow space with quiet coordination, the kind that happens naturally when two people fall into step without speaking. Like he hadn't meant to make contact at all but hadn't pulled away either, and the touch was so brief it could have been imagined. But the warmth it left beneath my skin stayed long after he had already turned to reach for a napkin. Neither of us acknowledged it, not with a glance or a word, but something shifted after that moment, something subtle that changed the space between us without making a sound. And even as we ate the tart and Richard teased Evan about his pastry obsession, I felt that awareness returning every time our hands came close, while reaching for spoons or refilling water, as if some invisible thread had been strung between us that neither of us pulled on, but neither of us severed either. When the evening began to wind down and Richard rose to rinse the last of the plates, Evan stayed seated for a moment longer, and as I gathered my sweater from the back of the chair, he looked up at me again, just once, quietly, and said, "It was really nice meeting you, Jenna." And before I could answer, he added, "I hope this isn't the last time." And the way he said it was so simple, so direct, so entirely without pressure or performance that it landed more deeply than if he'd said anything clever or flirtatious. And all I could do in return was smile, unsure of whether the warmth in my chest was gratitude, surprise, or something else entirely. I moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but because something in me didn't want to disturb the stillness that had settled in the space they'd just left. And as I reached the front of the house, I saw Evan pause at the open door. One hand braced lightly on the frame as he looked out at the darkened street, the porch light catching just enough of his profile to remind me that certain people don't have to fill a room to stay inside it after they've gone. He turned his head just enough to speak over his shoulder, this time not to Richard but to both of us, his voice calm, polite, final in that easy, deliberate way that closes a night without making it feel like an ending. And though I can't remember his exact words, I remember the way he said them, like a ribbon being tied, clean and quiet. And then he was gone. Footsteps on gravel, the click of a car door, the quiet start of an engine dissolving into the background as though he'd never been there at all. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or strained, just present, a thin thread hanging in the air that neither of us quite knew how to cut. And as Richard closed the door and locked it with a casual motion, he glanced toward me with the kind of look that felt more like acknowledgement than inquiry, like he had noticed something shift but didn't feel the need to name it, which in a way made it feel even more visible. He offered me coffee, a nightcap, a place to sit if I wasn't in a rush to get home, and though the polite answer would have been a soft decline paired with a thankful smile, what I said instead was that I wouldn't mind a little more time. And the way he nodded, slight, understanding, without surprise, told me he'd already assumed as much. We sat again, this time in the smaller den where the lighting was lower and the chairs deeper, and though the conversation didn't pick up exactly where it had left off, it shifted into something more settled. The kind of talk that fills the edges of a room rather than its center. And we spoke of things like sleep patterns and the strange, quiet rituals of living alone, how people develop habits that don't make sense to anyone else but become anchors when everything else changes. He told me about the year after his wife passed, how he couldn't bring himself to rearrange the spices in the pantry because she'd had them in alphabetical order, and even now he couldn't find the will to undo something she touched every day. And I told him about the night I left my husband's favorite coffee mug outside on purpose just to let the rain fill it, like a way of washing away the part of him I no longer needed. And for a moment, we both just sat there, our stories sitting quietly between us like folded blankets. Not burdens, not tragedies, just parts of ourselves that didn't need fixing, only airing out. Eventually, I stood, more out of instinct than readiness to leave, and Richard rose with me, walking me to the door without making it feel like an obligation. And as I slipped my arms into my coat and reached for my bag, he said, "My name, just once, Jenna," low and soft. And when I turned toward him, he simply said he was glad I'd come, that it had been a good night. And something in the way he said it made me feel like I'd been part of something that wasn't about him or Evan or even me, but about the space between people when all the noise falls away and you can hear what's actually there. The walk. Home was short, the air cool and still, and though nothing had happened that could be pointed to, nothing said that couldn't be written off as kind or ordinary. I felt different as I stepped inside, not changed completely, but adjusted in some small way, like something had been moved half an inch to the left and now the room looked just slightly different. I didn't turn on the lights, didn't check my phone or the clock or the kitchen sink where I'd left a half-finished cup of tea. I just stood in the doorway for a while, coat still on, fingers resting against the strap of my bag, and I let the silence settle around me, not to drown anything out, but to listen more closely to whatever had quietly begun. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I'd slept well or felt particularly rested, but because my mind had been sifting through the same images on repeat, moments, from the night before that shouldn't have felt important and yet refused to settle quietly. And though I told myself it was just the wine or the newness of company, after such a long stretch of solitude, I knew I wasn't being honest, because the truth, however uncomfortable, was that it wasn't Richard's voice or presence or even his kindness that lingered like warmth pressed into my skin. It was Evan. Not his words exactly, but the way he'd looked at me when he said them, and the way that look seemed to stay long after the conversation had moved on. I moved through the morning slowly, every motion delayed by distraction, my hands washing the same coffee mug twice, my eyes scanning the same paragraph in a book I wasn't actually reading. And though I tried to redirect my focus toward more appropriate thoughts, emails I hadn't answered, errands I'd ignored, laundry waiting to be folded, I kept finding myself drawn back into the memory of his voice. As he stood at the door, the way he hadn't tried to say something clever or unnecessary, the way he'd spoken like someone who knew the weight of words and didn't waste them. I hated that it had taken up this much space in my head, not because it was inappropriate, though of course that part unnerved me too, but because I wasn't used to this kind of response in myself anymore. This subtle ache of interest that didn't announce itself loudly, but moved like steam under the surface, impossible to hold and yet constantly rising. And when I caught myself checking the time, just to imagine where he might be in his day, I felt a flush of embarrassment so sharp that I had to close my eyes and take a breath just to quiet the spiral before it turned into something louder. He's too young, I told myself, too sharp at the edges in a way I haven't been in years. And beyond all of that, he's Richard's son. And the mere fact that I'd even allowed space for the thought made something coil tight in my chest, some hybrid of guilt and curiosity that I couldn't quite place, and yet no amount of scolding made the memory soften. If anything, it made it clearer, more detailed, like my mind had decided that if I was going to be haunted, it might as well do it with clarity. Around 10, my phone buzzed on the counter and I reached for it with the kind of hesitation that only comes when you already suspect who it might be. And though the name that lit the screen wasn't Evans, it still made my breath hold for half a beat. Richard, with a short message that read, "Thanks for last night, it was good to laugh again, and Evan said he was glad to meet you too." And even though the words were simple, almost routine, I reread them 3, then 4 times, watching how my eyes always returned to the part that mentioned him, as if confirmation that he'd noticed me was something I wasn't allowed to want but couldn't stop seeking. I didn't answer right away because I didn't know what I wanted to say. Or rather, I knew exactly what I wanted to say and also knew better than to say any of it. So instead, I tucked the phone into my coat pocket and told myself I needed air. Needed to move my body through something colder than my thoughts before. They turned in on themselves again, and I clipped the leash onto Scout's collar, laced up my boots, and stepped out into the crispness of a morning that had no business feeling as loud as it did. The sidewalks were still damp from the night's rain, and the wind moved through the bare branches above with that hushed, brittle quality that always made the air feel a little more intimate, and I walked without direction, letting Scout pull me into the rhythm of his nose-led wanderings until I turned onto the shaded side of the next block and saw a familiar figure leaning against the side rail near the cafe's back door, head tilted slightly, earbuds in, gaze pointed somewhere far off. He didn't see me right away, which gave me a second to gather myself, to pull my thoughts back into something more neutral, more composed. But the moment he did look up and register, something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement. A recognition that didn't feel casual, and before I could even raise a hand in greeting, he'd already pulled out one earbud and was stepping away from the railing like the space between us didn't need permission to close. I opened my mouth to say something, though I hadn't yet decided what, but he beat me to it with a question. Delivered so casually it might have passed for small talk if not for the way he said it. "Do you want to grab a coffee?" And then, after the briefest pause, as if he already knew how bad the coffee was but trusted the reason to matter more, he added, "The place just around the corner. It's terrible at lattes but pretty good for conversations." And though I should have hesitated, should have made some excuse or at least let the silence stretch longer, I found myself nodding before the second sentence had fully landed, because the part of me that should have resisted had already stepped forward. We didn't speak as we walked the short distance to the cafe, and though the silence could have turned awkward, it didn't, because something about being beside him didn't ask for conversation in the way most silences do. And the longer we moved together, the more I noticed how comfortable he seemed with the space between us, how he didn't rush to fill it or glance over like he needed to check if I was still with him, how he simply walked as if being near was enough to make it understood that I was welcome here. And that simple ease, that quiet confidence, settled in my chest like something both familiar and foreign, like the feeling of being trusted when you haven't earned it yet but might want to. The cafe was small and a little run down, with chipped paint on the front door and a crooked chalkboard sign that promised the best, worst espresso in town. And when he reached for the handle and stepped aside to let me in first, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't chivalry but attentiveness. Like he noticed the small ways people move through the world and adjusted to them without turning it into a gesture. And when we stepped inside and the door closed behind us with a soft wooden thud, the scent of burnt espresso and something vaguely cinnamon settled around us like a blanket that had been forgotten in the dryer just a little too long. He pointed to a booth in the back with his chin, not because he was being casual, but because his hands were already in his jacket pockets, and as I followed him there and slid into the seat across from him, I felt the strange, grounding comfort of being in a space that didn't require performance, that didn't demand small talk or artificial smiles. And though I hadn't planned for this and didn't know what to expect, I also didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not when the quiet felt this full. The waitress arrived without a notepad, looking like she'd been there since the place opened, 20 years ago, and didn't care whether we ordered or not. And Evan smiled at her with a kind of worn-in familiarity that made me wonder how many times he'd sat exactly here before. And when he said, "Just 2 lattes?" she rolled her eyes and muttered something about the machine hating her today, but walked away all the same, and I couldn't help but laugh at the easy rhythm of it, like this whole interaction was part of some script that only locals got to read. He leaned forward then, not in a way that pressed against the table or made the space between us feel smaller, but just enough to signal that he was here now, fully, not distracted or killing time. And he said, "You don't seem like someone who lets people in easily." And though the words could have been intrusive from anyone else, from him they felt more like observation than judgment, more like curiosity shaped by instinct. And I found myself answering without defensiveness, saying, "I don't, usually," before I even realized I'd spoken aloud. He nodded slowly, like that made sense, like it was exactly what he'd expected me to say. And then he tilted his head slightly, watching me with that same level gaze I remembered from the night before, the one that made you feel like he was studying the rhythm beneath your words rather than just hearing them. And he said, "But you did last night." And the simplicity of that sentence struck something deeper than I wanted it to, because I knew it was true, and I hadn't meant for it to be. And yet there we were, sitting in a booth surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and the low hum of a broken refrigerator fan, unraveling something I hadn't realized had begun to fray. We sat there for a while after that, not talking much, letting the comfort of shared silence grow around us. And though nothing was said that couldn't be said in front of anyone, everything about that morning felt like a conversation we'd only just begun, one that might not follow rules or labels or expectations, but one that neither of us seemed ready to walk away from yet. Even though the cafe around us had begun to fill with the usual weekend rush of noise, cups clinking against saucers, blenders whirring behind the counter, voices overlapping in messy fragments of conversation that rose and fell like tides slapping at the walls. I noticed that none of it seemed to reach us where we sat, and though our booth wasn't far from the barista station and people passed close enough for the occasional coat hem or elbow to graze the edge of the seat, it felt like Evan and I existed in some kind of soft enclosure, a pocket of air carved out between our mugs and our silence, as if we'd unknowingly agreed that nothing beyond the table mattered right now, and even though I was aware of the clamor. It dulled at the edges like someone had turned down the world just enough for me to focus only on the way his fingers rested loosely around his cup and the way his voice carried not loudly, but clearly when he finally began to speak. He didn't introduce the subject carefully or lead into it like a story that needed context or build-up. He just said her name, his mother's, softly, as if it was a word he hadn't spoken out loud in a while and wasn't sure how it would feel in his mouth. And then he said that losing her hadn't been like losing a parent the way people prepare for it, the way people talk about grief in stages or in waves, because for him it had felt more like a sudden silence that settled into everything, not dramatic or violent but persistent, like background static you couldn't switch off. And I didn't interrupt because the way he spoke wasn't fragile or in need of comfort. It was steady and matter-of-fact. But behind that steadiness was something more complicated, and I sensed that what he needed wasn't someone to soothe him, but someone to listen without flinching. He told me it was hardest not at the funeral, or in the weeks right after when everyone brought food and sent flowers and said things like, "Take your time." But later, when his father started moving around the house again in ways that felt foreign, when he noticed Richard standing by the kitchen sink not doing dishes but just looking out the window like he was waiting for something to move, and how, even then, he didn't say much, didn't talk about the loss or the loneliness or even the memories, just kept going with a quiet persistence that felt more like survival than healing, and how Evan had watched that for years, had lived inside the same house with a man who didn't speak what he carried, until suddenly, one day, that changed. At this point, his eyes didn't leave mine, and I felt that weight again. That way he had of speaking not to you, but into you. Like he was trusting you with something, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. And he said, "Then you came over." And I started to protest, to deflect or downplay whatever he meant by that. But he cut me off gently, not harshly, just with that same calm tone and said, "No, listen. I don't mean it like it was romantic or anything like that. I mean that something happened when you walked through our front door, and I saw it the moment it started. The way he looked at you like he hadn't looked at anyone in a very long time. Not with hope or longing exactly, but with presence, like he finally came back into his own body after years of floating above it, and maybe you didn't mean to do that, but you did." I didn't know how to respond at first because I had expected judgment or discomfort, or at least a flicker of defensiveness, something to remind me of the invisible line I might be towing by growing too close to a man who had been marked by grief and time and fatherhood. But instead I found myself staring down at the pale rings of foam left on my latte, and wondering how someone so young could speak with that kind of insight. And before I could stop myself, I laughed. Not loudly, not out of amusement but surprise, and said, "You're far too old for 27. And he tilted his head, mouth curling at one side, and replied, "Or maybe you're too young for 41. And we both sat with the echo of that between us, not as a flirtation, but as something else entirely, something that blurred the definitions I'd relied on for so long. When we finally stood to leave, the noise of the cafe seemed to rush back in, a sudden gust of sound that reminded me how quiet it had been between us, and we stepped outside into the late morning air, where the wind had picked up just enough to tug at my scarf and make me regret leaving the gloves at home. But even then, with the street humming back to life and people passing us without notice, I still felt the residue of that enclosed stillness between us, as if we carried it now like something folded and tucked into our coats. He walked me home without asking, matching my pace easily, saying little, which somehow felt more meaningful than if he'd tried to fill the space with conversation. And when we reached my front steps, he stopped just short of them, hands in his pockets, eyes on mine, and for a moment we stood there in the kind of quiet that's not empty, but full of all the things that haven't yet decided what to become. And though I didn't step forward and he didn't lean in, and neither of us moved toward anything that would need to be undone, and though we said nothing and did nothing to break the quiet, there was a shared understanding between us, a kind of stillness that didn't require words to be meaningful. Not because it lacked force, but because it respected the weight of its own timing. I said thank you. Not because it felt sufficient, but because I didn't trust myself to say more without unraveling something I wasn't ready to name. And when he said, anytime, I believed him not as a politeness, but as a promise. And when I finally went inside and leaned back against the closed door with my coat still on, and my fingers pressed gently against the center of my chest, I could feel my heart beating fast and strong, not from panic or nerves or fear of what might come, but because for the first time in what felt like years, it was beating for something real and immediate and alive. I didn't take off my coat right away, and I didn't move from the door either, because standing there with my back pressed to the wood and my hand still resting against my chest felt like the only way to hold on to the moment before it dissolved into the noise of the afternoon. And even though nothing had happened in the obvious sense, no kiss, no confession, no grand shift that could be pointed to or explained, everything inside me was humming with the aftershock of something that didn't need a name to feel real. And I knew if I walked into the kitchen or started the laundry or even unwrapped my scarf too quickly, I'd lose the shape of what had just unfolded. So I stayed there, breathing evenly, not to calm down, but to stay present inside whatever. This was before the day tried to strip it away. The house felt different, not colder or warmer, just changed, like something had passed through it in my absence and left the walls vibrating with a new frequency. And as I walked slowly down the hallway, past the photos I never took down and the stack of unopened mail that always seemed to multiply without my permission, I caught my own reflection in the hallway mirror and stopped short because something in my face looked unfamiliar. Not younger exactly, but softer around the edges, like something dormant had stirred and risen to the surface. Something I wasn't entirely sure how to carry now that it was awake. I moved into the kitchen on autopilot, putting the kettle on, not because I needed more caffeine, but because the ritual of preparing tea had always been my way of settling the chaos when my thoughts moved too fast. And I watched the water heat while the light from the window stretched slowly across the counter, soft and angled and golden in a way that made everything look a little more forgiving. And I realized then that I wasn't thinking about Richard at all, not in the way I expected to after spending time at his table and sitting across from him in shared laughter and stories, but that every moment since I'd stepped into the cafe had belonged entirely to Evan. Not because I chose for it to be that way, but because something about his presence didn't leave room for anyone else to linger. That realization unsettled me, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt honest. And honesty, when you're not prepared for it, has a way of cracking something beneath the surface. And as I poured the water and watched it rise in slow spirals inside the mug, I heard myself whisper out loud, "What are you doing?" Not as a reprimand, but as a question. As if my heart and mind were now two separate entities negotiating unfamiliar terrain, and though neither offered a clear answer, I knew I wasn't ready to retreat, back into the safety of pretending that nothing had shifted. The tea steeped longer than it should have. The bag left floating near the rim while I stood leaning on the counter, remembering the exact cadence of his voice when he said, "any time." The subtle emphasis on the first syllable that made it sound not like a casual offer, but a certainty. And I wondered how someone could speak with so little hesitation about things most people avoided even thinking about. How he could look at me without the veil of expectation and still manage to make me feel seen, not in the flattering way, but in the quiet way that felt like recognition. Later, as the light dimmed and the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself replaying the walk home in reverse. Not just the words exchanged, but the silences, the space between our footsteps, the warmth that rose along my spine when I glanced over and found him already looking at me, not with hunger or curiosity or charm, but with attention so complete. It bordered on reverence, and I wondered if he knew what that kind of gaze could do to someone who had grown used to being partially invisible. When night finally came and I moved through the familiar motions of locking the door, folding the blanket over the arm of the couch, brushing my teeth without looking directly into the bathroom mirror, I didn't try to talk myself out of what I was feeling, because there was nothing sordid in it, nothing shameful, only the simple truth that something in Evan's presence had pulled me out of a place I didn't even know I'd been living. And that truth, as quiet as it was, didn't ask for permission to exist. I slipped into bed without checking my phone, without scrolling, through the apps that usually lulled me into a restless sleep. And instead I lay there in the dark, listening to the faint tick of the radiator, the occasional bark of a distant dog, the rhythm of my own breath steadying itself against the soft fabric of the pillow, and even with my eyes closed, I could still see him standing on the sidewalk, his hands tucked into his pockets, his body leaning slightly away from the house as if to remind me he wasn't pushing, wasn't rushing, just waiting in that quiet way of his for something to unfold at its own pace. And as my hand drifted once again to the center of my chest, not in fear or uncertainty but in instinct, I felt my heartbeat beneath it, steady and vibrant, and I whispered, into the stillness of the room, I feel it. Not to name it, or define it, or confess to anything beyond the fact that I was awake in my own body again, not because of a touch or a word, but because someone had met me where I was, and left. Just enough space for me to meet myself there too. I hadn't expected to hear from Richard so soon, and maybe that was why when his message arrived the next afternoon asking if I might like to come by again for dinner. Same time, nothing fancy, just something on the grill and a bottle already, open. I felt that familiar flicker in my chest, not from surprise exactly, but from the quiet anticipation that now seemed to stir whenever that house came to mind. And though I typed my reply with practiced ease saying that I'd love to and that it sounded perfect, what I didn't say, what I couldn't write in that moment, was that it wasn't the food or the company or even the comfort of Richard's presence that made me hesitate slightly before pressing send, but the possibility that Evan might be there again, and that I wasn't ready to decide what that meant. The day passed in a blur of tasks I couldn't fully focus on, and by the time I stood in front of my closet choosing something neutral enough not to feel like effort, but considered enough to show I hadn't come carelessly, I realized that the same quiet tension that had taken root last time hadn't left me. It had simply moved deeper, less visible, but no less alive. And as I arrived at the house just after 7 and stepped through the open door to Richard's easy greeting and the familiar scent of rosemary and butter warming in the air, I caught, out of the corner of my eye, the unmistakable figure of Evan already seated on the edge of the porch, sleeves rolled, a glass in his hand, his gaze focused on something unseen in the yard. He turned only slightly when I entered, just enough to acknowledge me without pulling the focus of the room, but the subtle rise of his eyebrows and the way the corners of his mouth shifted told me he'd been expecting me, and that expectation landed in my chest not like pressure, but like confirmation. And suddenly the room felt smaller. Not because of its size, but because of everything left unsaid, now occupying the space between us. The dinner unfolded with a rhythm that felt both practiced and altered, with Richard carrying the conversation gently as he always did, but this time leaving longer pauses between subjects, as if testing whether we would fill the silence or let it settle. And Evan, for his part, spoke less than before. Not from disinterest or discomfort, but with the kind of deliberate quiet that turns every glance into a question and every sip of wine into something loaded. And though I answered when spoken to and offered smiles when appropriate, I couldn't ignore how much of my energy was focused not on the meal or the stories, but on the way his presence had changed the atmosphere into something taut and breathless without ever breaking the surface. At some point, long after the plates had been cleared and the last remnants of grilled peach and vanilla ice cream had been scooped from shallow bowls, Richard stepped out to take a call, saying something about work and shaking his head as he walked toward the den with his phone pressed to his ear, and I was left standing by the sink with my hands full of half-rinsed wine glasses and a heart that had already begun to beat in patterns I didn't recognize. And I wasn't surprised when Evan appeared beside me without a word, sleeves still rolled, reaching for a dish towel like this was just the next scene in a sequence we'd both accepted. We moved quietly, the water running low and steady, the clink of glass against ceramic the only sound between us, but it wasn't silence in the true sense. It was the kind of stillness that brims with unspoken language, the kind that pulses under the skin and turns every accidental brush of fingers into a deliberate conversation. And when our hands met at the edge of the counter as I passed him a plate, his didn't pull away, didn't flinch or recoil, but stayed there, firm and warm and certain, pressing into mine with the kind of quiet insistence that made my breath pause and my thoughts scatter in directions I couldn't contain. We didn't look at each other right away, but I felt the weight of his attention like heat on the back of my neck, and when I finally turned toward him, letting my hand remain against his a moment longer than I should have, he spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for misinterpretation, and said, "I think you've been asking yourself the same question since the first night we met." And I didn't pretend not to understand, didn't laugh or deflect or fold into modesty, because the truth of it had already settled between us, and naming it, didn't make it heavier, it just made it undeniable. I stood there with my hand, still under his, with the wet edge of a glass still dripping beside us, and I felt the moment stretch, not into discomfort, but into a decision. And though the answer wasn't easy, it wasn't complicated either. And when I finally looked at him, not around him, not past him, but directly into him, I said, yes. I've been asking myself if I should be here, if I have the right, if this is a line I'll regret crossing. And I let the silence hold the weight of that for just a breath before finishing. But I'm still here, aren't I? And the way his hand curled slightly around mine in response made it clear that I wasn't the only one who had been waiting for that moment to arrive exactly as it did, slow, certain, and without retreat. We stood like that for a moment longer than reason allowed. Our hands briefly overlapped as we passed the dish between us, and neither of us commented on it, treating the moment as simply part of the evening's quiet rhythm. And I felt the weight of that contact settle across my shoulders, not like a burden, but like a blanket, warm and undeniable. And though the rational part of me, the part shaped by rules and years and lines not meant to blur, was already whispering that this was too close, too intimate, too soon, the part of me that had been quiet for too long simply stayed where it was, grounded in the reality of his touch and the fact that neither of us had made a move to break it. There was something in the air between us that didn't require explanation, something I couldn't define in exact terms but could feel in the way my breath slowed to meet the pace of his, in the way the clinking of silverware and the humming of the refrigerator faded behind the tension that wasn't really tension at all, just the weight of mutual awareness finally given room to breathe. And as I stood there beside the sink, still holding the last clean plate and feeling the water cool on my wrist, I realized that this wasn't about a single gesture or conversation, but about every moment that had brought us here, small and cumulative, as natural and irreversible as a tide shifting beneath the moon. He stepped back then, not abruptly, but with intention, and as he reached for the dish towel to dry his hands, he looked at me with an expression that wasn't filled with urgency or expectation, but with something far more dangerous, patience. And I understood in that moment that this was not a man who rushed toward anything, but one who watched and waited until what was inevitable simply unfolded on its own. And that knowledge didn't unsettle me as much as it should have. Instead, it wrapped itself around me like truth spoken too quietly to ignore. I turned toward the table, pretending to check the chairs or align the placemats, anything to give my hands something to do. But the rhythm of the evening had already changed. The easy flow of pleasantries and half-finished anecdotes replaced by something slower, more deliberate, as though every breath I took now carried a question beneath it, one I wasn't sure I wanted answered but couldn't stop asking anyway. And when I glanced over my shoulder and caught him still watching me, not with hunger or possession, but with the kind of focus that makes you feel like every version of yourself is being seen at once, I felt something inside me settle rather, then ignite. He didn't move closer again, didn't offer more than what had already been exchanged, and that, in some strange way, made the moment feel even more intimate, because it wasn't about escalation or seduction or anything that might have fit into a simpler story. It was about the tension that exists when two people realize they're no longer pretending that a boundary hasn't already been crossed. Not in action, but in intention. And though neither of us said it out loud, we both knew that the question now wasn't whether it could happen, but what would happen if it did. The sound of Richard's voice filtered back in then, muffled and calm. The final words of a conversation he'd taken into the den now drifting back through the hallway like a distant bell, reminding us where we were, and I stepped away from the table and back toward the sink, rinsing my hands more forcefully than necessary, letting the cold water anchor me to something physical, something unambiguous. And by the time Richard walked into the kitchen again, phone in one hand and a smile tugging faintly at the corners of his mouth, Evan had already dried his hands and moved to lean casually against the far counter, the silence between us tucked neatly beneath the rhythm of a returning host. We didn't speak much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the kind of words we needed didn't fit into the cadence of small talk or shared desserts. And when I finally stood to leave, thanking Richard for the meal and the company and giving Evan a nod that held more than I let show, I felt something shift in my chest, not like guilt or confusion, but like alignment. Like two parts of myself finally occupying the same space after being divided for too long. Evan didn't walk me to the door this time, didn't follow me into the entryway or offer some clever farewell. He simply stayed where he was, arms crossed, lightly over his chest, watching with the kind of quiet surety that didn't ask for promises or hint at impatience, And when our eyes met one last time before I stepped outside, there was nothing performative about it, only the clean certainty of two people who had chosen, separately but simultaneously, not to look away. The night was cooler than I expected. The kind of cool that crept up your arms and across the base of your neck in slow, unhurried waves. And I walked home with my coat open and my hands tucked into my sleeves. Not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold on to. Something to tether me as my mind spun around a single sentence he had spoken in a voice that refused to leave me. I think you've been asking yourself the same question. And the truth was, I had. And the answer hadn't changed anything. Except for everything. By the time I reached my porch and unlocked the door, the silence of my house didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a pause between beats, like the breath you take before the next movement in a song begins. And I stepped inside, not with caution, but with awareness, letting the door close behind me as I leaned back into it and whispered the only truth that mattered now, not to justify or explain or prepare, but to simply admit to the air that still held his presence. I'm still here. It was already dark by the time I arrived, the sky soft with that particular kind of stillness that makes everything feel suspended in a breath not yet exhaled, and when I stepped through the front door, shrugging off my coat and slipping out of my boots with practiced quiet, the house met me with warmth, and the scent of something rich left simmering too long, as if Richard had begun dinner with intention, but let it drift unattended. And when I moved further in and found the kitchen, empty, the lights low, only the soft shuffle of music playing through a speaker on the sideboard, I knew he wasn't home yet, and that I'd walked into a space holding its breath for more than one reason. Evan was already there, of course, leaning against the counter, in that way of his that never looked intentional, but always felt like something choreographed by instinct, his sleeves pushed up, hands wrapped loosely around a glass he hadn't sipped from in a while, and when he looked at me, the silence between us didn't feel uncertain or heavy, only charged in that quiet, invisible way a room sometimes changes when you enter it, not because something has happened, but because something will, and though no words passed between us at first, we both knew we'd arrived at the edge of whatever we hadn't been saying. He gestured toward the wine, pouring another glass without asking, sliding it across the counter like he already knew I'd accept it. And I did, if only because holding something gave me a reason to look down, to gather myself, to study the reflection of the room in the curve of the glass rather than meet the weight in his eyes too soon. But even that small pause didn't change the fact that everything about him tonight felt more open, less guarded, like some invisible wall had finally given way, not with drama, but with quiet resignation. We didn't sit right away, didn't fall into conversation, didn't pretend to be distracted by the news playing muted across the screen in the corner. We just stood across from each other, the space between us not wide but thick with all the moments we'd left unfinished, and I felt the tension rise not like a warning but like a pull, a magnetic drift that had no agenda beyond truth. And when I finally raised my eyes and looked directly into his, I saw that whatever I'd been trying not to acknowledge in myself had already settled in him with clarity. He moved first, not closer, not away, just differently, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, his hand coming to rest along the edge of the counter as if anchoring himself, and then, without asking and without hesitation, he lifted his other hand and touched my face, not dramatically, not with pressure, just the light brush of his fingertips along my cheek in a gesture so careful it almost undid me, not because of the touch itself, but because of what lived inside. It. Recognition, restraint, and something that felt dangerously close to sorrow. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't close my eyes or lean in or give him anything but stillness. And in that stillness, the air between us became something else entirely. Not a barrier, but a mirror, reflecting every question we hadn't asked, every boundary we'd respected, and every impulse we'd buried under reason. And when he finally let his hand fall back to his side, the loss of it felt like the sudden absence of a heartbeat, and I knew in that instant that whatever line we'd been walking wasn't a line at all anymore, but a quiet crossroads with no signposts. He spoke, softly then, his voice carrying more weight in its calm than most people do in their shouts, and he said, "I don't want to be the one who ruins what holds him together." And though he didn't name his father, we both knew that was who he meant. But I also can't stop feeling what I feel. And those words, so simple, so utterly honest, cut through the last layer of distance between us. Not to close it, but to reveal that it had never been as wide as we pretended. I wanted to answer him right away. Wanted to say something that would carry equal weight, something that wouldn't sound like an excuse or a confession or a door slammed shut. But my voice stayed behind the knot in my throat, and all I could do was nod slowly, letting the moment hold itself without forcing a resolution it didn't need. And when I finally spoke, it wasn't a declaration or even an invitation. It was only the truth, raw and still forming. And I said, I know. Because I did. Because I had felt it. 2. Every silent admission between our glances and every decision left unmade for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. We didn't move after that, didn't reach for each other, didn't try to rewrite the room with action. We simply stood in the soft hum of the house and let the silence stretch between us again. But this time, it wasn't to hide or stall or avoid. It was to make space for what had been spoken and what hadn't. And in that space, for the first time, I felt the full weight of what had been building. Not passion or longing or even confusion, but understanding, deep and quiet and painful in its clarity. The front door opened not long after, the latch clicking gently as Richard stepped inside with the sound of his coat brushing the doorway. And as he walked into the kitchen, keys in, hand and eyes already scanning the room, I saw the shift in him the moment he registered the stillness between us. The way his gaze moved from me to Evan and back again. Not suspicious, not angry, but weary in that particular way only people who've lived through too many endings recognize. And when his eyes finally settled on mine, I saw the resignation in them before a single word was spoken. He didn't say anything right away, didn't raise his voice or shift uncomfortably or look away like someone pretending not to understand what had already made itself visible in the space between us. Instead, he stood there in the doorway with his hand still wrapped around his keys, the metal catching the light in a small, distracted flicker. And though his body remained still, something in his face gave itself away in a slow exhale, as if whatever explanation he might have needed had already arrived long before he opened that door, and what was left now was only the weight of acceptance. Brittle and uneven and far too quiet to protect anyone from the truth. Evan stepped back slightly, not out of guilt or shame or any need to correct the moment, but as a form of respect, as if acknowledging that some things were not meant to be hidden, only handled gently. When they finally surfaced, and I felt that retreat in the air behind me like a ripple across glass. And though I didn't move to stop him, my body tensed with the realization that the moment we had all tried to avoid had now arrived, not with an argument or a mistake, but with an unbearable kind of honesty. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice wasn't hard or cold or cracked. With emotion, it was just tired in a way I hadn't heard before, a kind of tired that comes from losing something before you even realized it had been borrowed. I didn't move to the door, didn't rush to the window or call out a name. I only closed my eyes and let the sound settle over me. And as the corner of my mouth lifted into something that felt more like recognition than surprise, I whispered nothing at all, because whoever had come was already known, and whatever came next no longer needed a name.